The birthday cake sat untouched on the granite countertop. 23 candles, melting into colorful wax puddles that would stain the expensive surface my mother obsessed over keeping pristine. The silence in our Malibu Hills mansion was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below, and my father's measured footsteps as he paced behind me. I could feel the weight of their stares boring into my back as I stood frozen in the marble foyer, my overnight bag clutched in trembling hands, trying to process the words that had just shattered my world into irreparable pieces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You have until sunrise to collect whatever you can carry. My mother's voice cut through the air like ice, each syllable delivered with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. After that, the security codes will be changed, and you'll be considered a trespasser on private property. 23 years old today, and this was my birthday gift from the people who'd brought me into the world. Not the celebration I'd imagined when I'd driven up the winding coastal highway from UCLA just hours earlier, my master's degree in forensic accounting finally complete, ready to surprise them with news of my early graduation and job offer from one of the most prestigious financial investigation firms in Los Angeles. Instead, I was being expelled from the only home I'd ever known, like some kind of criminal, all because I'd refused to play along with their latest scheme to maintain their crumbling empire of lies. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed, leaving me breathless with the realization that my parents had never seen me as their daughter, but rather as a liability to be managed and ultimately discarded when I became inconvenient to their carefully constructed facade. Standing in that foyer, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that I now understood had been built on foundations far more precarious than I'd ever imagined, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The naive girl who'd believed in family loyalty and unconditional love was dissolving, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. My name is Sophia Elena Blackwell, though after tonight I'd be questioning whether I deserved to carry a surname that had become synonymous with corruption masquerading as respectability. For 23 years I'd been the perfect daughter to Marcus and Victoria Blackwell, maintaining impeccable grades while pursuing the kind of prestigious education that would reflect well on their social standing. I'd attended charity galas in designer gowns, smiled politely during family photo shoots for lifestyle magazines, and never once questioned why our lavish lifestyle seemed disconnected from any legitimate source of income I could identify. The Blackwell name opened doors throughout Southern California's elite circles, my father's supposed expertise in international investment consulting providing entree to exclusive country clubs and private investment opportunities that ordinary people could never access. My mother's reputation as a philanthropist and socialite had secured her positions on boards of prestigious cultural institutions, her face appearing regularly in society publications that documented the important charitable work being done by prominent families in our community. What I discovered 3 days ago, quite by accident while helping organize documents for their accountant, was that our entire life was an elaborate performance designed to conceal the systematic embezzlement of client funds that had been ongoing for nearly a decade. My parents weren't successful international consultants maintaining multiple legitimate business interests. They were sophisticated con artists who'd perfected the art of stealing from wealthy individuals too embarrassed to report being victimized by people they'd considered friends. The revelation had come through a misdelivered email that appeared in my UCLA account due to a clerical error by their assistant. The message contained detailed instructions for transferring funds from client accounts into offshore holdings that bore no resemblance to the investment opportunities described in official documentation. Reading through the thread of communications that followed, I'd realized that my parents had been systematically defrauding clients for years, using their social connections and prestigious lifestyle to access financial information that they then exploited for personal gain. Confronting them about the evidence I'd discovered had triggered the response I was experiencing now. Rather than explanation or remorse, they'd shifted immediately into damage control mode, making clear that my continued presence in their lives represented an unacceptable risk to their ongoing operation. The daughter who'd accidentally stumbled across their secrets couldn't be trusted to maintain the silence that their freedom depended upon. "You always were too curious for your own good," my father said, his voice carrying the disappointment of someone whose careful plans had been disrupted by unforeseen complications. "We'd hoped that your education would teach you the value of discretion, but apparently academic success doesn't automatically confer wisdom about family loyalty. Family loyalty. The phrase was rich with irony coming from a man who'd spent my entire childhood teaching me about honor and integrity while simultaneously building a criminal enterprise that would eventually destroy dozens of families who'd trusted him with their financial security. The disconnect between his public persona and private actions was so complete that I wondered if he even remembered who he'd been before the lies became his primary identity. Perhaps this will serve as a valuable learning experience, my mother added, her tone suggesting that my expulsion was actually a generous gift rather than a devastating betrayal. Sometimes people need to experience real consequences before they develop proper judgment about what information should remain private. The casual cruelty of her words was breathtaking in its completeness. She was framing my discovery of their criminal activities as a character flaw that required correction rather than acknowledging that I'd stumbled across evidence of systematic fraud that would destroy lives if allowed to continue. In her version of reality, I was the problem that needed to be eliminated, not the criminal behavior that I'd accidentally exposed. The hours that followed my expulsion passed in a blur of practical necessities that felt surreal against the backdrop of emotional devastation. I'd driven down the coastal highway to a 24-hour diner in Santa Monica, my car loaded with whatever belongings I'd managed to gather during my brief window of access to the house. Sitting in a vinyl booth under fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving, I'd tried to process the reality that my entire life had just been redefined without my consent. The immediate practical concerns were overwhelming enough without the added burden of emotional processing. I needed somewhere to stay, at least temporarily until I could figure out longer-term arrangement. My bank account contained enough savings to cover a few weeks of basic expenses, but nothing approaching the resources I'd need to establish independent living in one of the most expensive metropolitan areas in the country. The job offer from Morrison Financial Investigations wouldn't begin for another month, leaving me in a precarious position that my parents had undoubtedly calculated when timing their dramatic expulsion. What they hadn't calculated was that their daughter's education in forensic accounting had provided her with skills that extended far beyond traditional financial analysis. My master's program had included extensive training in digital investigation techniques, electronic surveillance methods, and the kind of systematic documentation procedures used in white-collar crime prosecution. I'd learned to trace complex financial networks, identify suspicious transaction patterns, and recover information that people assumed had been permanently deleted. More importantly, I'd spent the past 2 years working as a research assistant for Professor Elena Martinez, whose consulting firm specialized in financial fraud investigations for federal prosecutors. The work had exposed me to sophisticated criminal schemes and taught me to recognize the kind of systematic deception that my parents had been practicing throughout my childhood. I understood not just how these schemes worked, but how they eventually collapsed when investigators with proper training applied sustained pressure to their vulnerable point. Sitting in that diner as dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean, I'd made 2 crucial decisions that would define everything that followed. First, I would not allow my parents to continue victimizing innocent people who trusted them with their financial security. Second, I would use every skill I'd developed over the past 5 years to systematically document their criminal activities and ensure that appropriate consequences followed their actions. The emotional component of my decision was straightforward revenge against people who'd chosen to destroy their daughter rather than acknowledge their own criminal behavior. But the practical component was more complex and ultimately more satisfying. I possessed specialized knowledge that made me uniquely qualified to investigate and expose exactly the kind of financial fraud that my parents had been practicing. They'd expelled me from their lives to protect their criminal enterprise, but in doing so they'd created an adversary whose professional training made her capable of destroying everything they'd built. The first step involved establishing a base of operations that would allow me to conduct comprehensive surveillance without detection. I'd rented a small apartment in Culver City using savings that my parents didn't know existed, money I'd accumulated through part-time consulting work that I'd never mentioned because they'd never shown interest in my academic or professional development. The location provided easy access to UCLA's research facilities, while maintaining sufficient distance from Malibu to avoid accidental encounter. The apartment was sparse but functional, containing everything I needed to conduct the kind of intensive investigation that would either vindicate my suspicions or provide evidence sufficient for federal prosecution. I'd installed multiple computer systems with secure internet connections. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Established encrypted communication channels with former classmates who worked in various investigative fields, and created backup storage systems for any evidence I managed to collect. The setup resembled a smaller version of the digital forensics laboratories I'd trained in during graduate school. My parents had made their first crucial error by assuming that I lacked the resources to pose any meaningful threat to their operation. They'd expelled me expecting that financial pressure and social isolation would force me to accept their version of events and maintain silence about what I'd discovered. What they hadn't considered was that their daughter had spent 5 years learning to trace financial crimes committed by people who believed they were too sophisticated to be caught by conventional investigation methods. The second error was even more significant. By cutting off all communication and changing security codes, they'd eliminated my ability to monitor their activities through casual observation. But they'd also eliminated their ability to monitor my activities or gauge my response to their betrayal. They had no idea what resources I possessed, what professional connections I'd developed, or what level of expertise I'd acquired during my years of specialized education. The investigation began with the most basic question that drives all forensic accounting work: tracing the flow of money from its source to its eventual destination. My parents maintained the appearance of running a legitimate consulting business, but the financial documentation I'd seen suggested that client funds were being diverted through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to obscure the trail of stolen money. Understanding the full scope of their operation required accessing information that they'd assumed was secure from outside scrutiny. Banking records, communication logs, client lists, and transaction histories would all be necessary to document the systematic nature of their fraud and identify the full extent of victim losses. Gathering this information would require techniques that operated in legal gray areas, but my training had prepared me for exactly this type of sensitive investigation. The tools I'd learned to use during my graduate research were designed for legitimate forensic accounting work, but they were equally effective for investigating criminal activities conducted by people who assumed their victims lacked the expertise to expose their method. My parents had built their careers on exploiting the financial trust of wealthy individuals who valued discretion above transparency. They'd never encountered an adversary who possessed both personal motivation and professional capabilities sufficient to penetrate their carefully constructed defenses. Professor Martinez had taught me that successful financial fraud investigation required patience, systematic documentation, and the kind of methodical approach that could withstand legal scrutiny when evidence was eventually presented in court. Emotional responses were counterproductive because they led to hasty decisions that compromised the quality of evidence collection. The most effective investigators were those who could maintain professional detachment while pursuing their objectives with sustained focus. Applying these principles to my personal situation meant suppressing the emotional devastation of my parents' betrayal in favor of the kind of clinical analysis that would produce actionable results. The hurt and anger were still present, but they became fuel for a systematic campaign rather than obstacles to clear thinking. My parents had destroyed their relationship with their daughter to protect their criminal enterprise. Now their daughter would use her professional expertise to destroy the criminal enterprise they'd valued more than family loyalty. The first week of investigation focused on establishing baseline understanding of their operations through publicly available information. Corporate filings, property records, and published financial statements provided insight into the legitimate aspects of their business structure. Social media activity and society publication coverage revealed their public relationships and social connection. Credit reports and background checks confirmed basic biographical information and identified potential vulnerabilities in their financial arrangements. This preliminary research revealed patterns that supported my suspicions about the criminal nature of their activity. The timeline of their lifestyle improvements corresponded closely with periods when they'd gained access to new client relationships. Their investment returns were consistently higher than market averages would support, suggesting systematic manipulation rather than legitimate trading success. Most tellingly, their personal expenditures exceeded their declared income by margins that could only be explained through undisclosed revenue sources. But public records provided only surface-level insight into operations that were designed to withstand casual scrutiny. Understanding the mechanics of their fraud would require accessing private information that they'd assumed was secure from outside investigation. This meant moving beyond conventional research into the kind of sophisticated electronic surveillance that my training had prepared me for, but that I'd never applied outside academic settings. The technical challenges were significant but not insurmountable. My parents had grown comfortable with technology that made their operations more efficient, but they'd failed to implement the kind of comprehensive security measures that would protect them from investigation by someone with my particular expertise. Their communications were encrypted but used commercially available systems with known vulnerabilities. Their financial records were stored electronically but relied on password protection rather than multi-factor authentication. Most importantly, they'd never considered that their own daughter might possess the technical skills necessary to penetrate their defenses. They'd dismissed my academic achievements as irrelevant practical considerations, never recognizing that forensic accounting had evolved into a sophisticated discipline that combined traditional financial analysis with cutting-edge digital investigation techniques. Their condescension toward my education had blinded them to the reality that I'd been training for exactly this type of confrontation without realizing it. The emotional component of my investigation was more complex than the technical challenges, requiring constant management to prevent personal feelings from compromising professional judgment. Every piece of evidence I uncovered revealed new layers of deception that had shaped my entire childhood. The family vacations I'd treasured were funded by money stolen from people who'd trusted my parents with their financial security. The prestigious schools I'd attended were paid for with fraud proceeds. Even the birthday celebrations that had made me feel loved and valued were purchased with resources that belonged to victims whose lives had been damaged by my parents' criminal activity. Processing these revelations while maintaining the kind of systematic approach that effective investigation required meant compartmentalizing emotional responses that threatened to overwhelm rational analysis. The betrayal was too massive to fully comprehend while simultaneously conducting the detailed work necessary to document criminal behavior. I learned to treat each piece of evidence as an abstract data point rather than a personal revelation, saving emotional processing for later when the investigation was complete. The breakthrough came during my second week of surveillance when I managed to access their primary email accounts through a combination of social engineering and technical exploitation that would have impressed my professor. The correspondence I discovered confirmed my worst suspicions while revealing criminal activities that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible. My parents weren't just stealing from clients. They were operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that relied on constant recruitment of new victims to fund payments to existing investors. The email threads showed systematic cultivation of wealthy individuals through social connection, carefully planned presentations of fraudulent investment opportunities, and coordinated efforts to maintain the illusion of legitimate returns while actually using new investor funds to pay previous commitments. The scheme was elaborate enough to have evaded detection for years, but it was also inherently unstable and would eventually collapse when new recruitment failed to keep pace with payment obligations. More damaging were the discussions about my own role in their operation. They'd been using information about my academic achievements and job prospects to enhance their credibility with potential investors, presenting themselves as a successful family whose daughter's accomplishments reflected their own legitimate business acumen. My education and career trajectory had become marketing tools for a criminal enterprise that I'd never consented to support. The final revelation was the most devastating of all. They'd been planning to involve me directly in their operations once I graduated, using my credentials in forensic accounting to provide apparent legitimacy to their investment recommendation. The job offer I'd received from Morrison Financial Investigations was seen as an opportunity to gather insider information about federal investigation techniques that could be used to protect their criminal activities from law enforcement scrutiny. My parents hadn't just betrayed me by expelling me from their lives, they'd been grooming me to become an unwitting accomplice in their criminal enterprise, planning to exploit my professional integrity to enhance their ability to victimize innocent people. The daughter they'd raised to value honesty and ethical behavior was intended to become a shield for activities that contradicted everything they'd taught me to believe about right and wrong. Understanding the full scope of their plans for my future crystallized my resolve to ensure that their criminal activities faced appropriate consequences. This wasn't just about revenge for their personal betrayal, though that motivation remained strong. It was about preventing them from victimizing additional people and ensuring that existing victims had access to whatever justice the legal system could provide. The evidence I'd collected was comprehensive enough to support federal criminal charges, but simply turning everything over to prosecutors would have provided my parents with opportunities to destroy additional evidence or flee the country before arrests could be made. More satisfying would be a strategy that exposed their criminal activities while simultaneously dismantling their ability to continue operations, creating immediate consequences that reflected the systematic nature of their betrayal. The plan that emerged from weeks of careful analysis was inspired by my understanding of how financial fraud schemes collapse when their underlying structure is exposed to sustained pressure. Rather than attacking their operations directly, I would systematically undermine the confidence and resources that their criminal enterprise depended upon, creating a cascade of consequences that would ultimately destroy everything they'd built while providing evidence for criminal prosecution. My parents had expelled me to protect their criminal activities from exposure. Now I would use every skill I'd developed over the past 5 years to ensure that their protection strategy became the catalyst for their complete destruction. They'd chosen to value their criminal enterprise over their relationship with their daughter. Soon they would discover that their daughter possessed exactly the capabilities necessary to destroy the criminal enterprise they'd protected at the cost of family loyalty. The systematic investigation was complete, the evidence was documented, and the strategy was prepared. All that remained was implementation of consequences that would be as comprehensive and devastating as the betrayal that had triggered them. My parents had taught me that actions have consequences through 23 years of careful moral instruction. Now I would provide them with a practical demonstration of exactly what that principle meant when applied to their own behavior. The woman they'd dismissed as an inconvenient liability was about to remind them that underestimating people whose professional training includes exposing financial fraud is a mistake that carries permanent consequences. They'd chosen to celebrate my 23rd birthday by destroying my faith and family loyalty. I would commemorate that choice by destroying the criminal empire they'd valued more than their daughter's love. The transformation from devastated daughter to methodical investigator required adopting the same emotional detachment that had made me successful in graduate school, but applying it to circumstances that were infinitely more personal and painful. My small apartment in Culver City became a command center for an operation that would either vindicate my suspicions or provide law enforcement with everything they needed to dismantle a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of social respectability for nearly a decade. The advanced surveillance equipment I'd acquired through former classmates who worked in corporate security filled every available surface in my living room, creating an electronic nerve center that would have impressed my professors at UCLA. Multiple computer systems running specialized forensic software connected to secure networks that could penetrate digital defenses without leaving traces of unauthorized access. High-resolution cameras with telephoto lenses capable of documenting activities from distances that made detection nearly impossible. Audio recording devices so sophisticated they could capture conversations through windows from across the street. But technology was only as effective as the strategy guiding its deployment, and my parents had spent years perfecting operational security measures that protected their activities from casual observation. Understanding their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and documenting their criminal behavior would require weeks of patient surveillance, combined with the kind of systematic analysis that could withstand the scrutiny of federal prosecutors when evidence was eventually presented in court. The first phase involved mapping their daily activities to identify patterns that could be exploited for evidence collection. My father maintained regular office hours at his downtown Los Angeles consulting firm, but the nature of his work required frequent travel to meet with clients whose financial affairs demanded discretion. My mother's schedule was more flexible, built around social obligations and charitable commitments, that provided cover for activities related to their criminal operation. Their Malibu mansion occupied 3 acres of prime coastal real estate protected by security systems that had been designed to prevent intrusion by conventional burglars, rather than surveillance by someone with my particular training. The electronic perimeter monitoring could be bypassed using techniques I'd learned during coursework on corporate espionage investigation. The motion sensors were calibrated for detecting full-sized intruders and could be avoided by someone who understood their placement and sensitivity ranges. More importantly, their personal security measures were based on protecting against external threats, rather than investigation by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of their habits and preferences. They'd never changed the Wi-Fi passwords that I'd helped establish years earlier when setting up their home network. Their alarm system used personal codes based on family birthdays and anniversaries that I could predict with perfect accuracy. Even their automobiles contained GPS tracking systems that could be accessed remotely by anyone with administrative privileges to their shared cloud storage account. The investigation began with financial surveillance designed to document the flow of money through their various business entities and personal accounts. Modern banking creates comprehensive digital records of every transaction, but accessing those records without authorization requires sophisticated techniques that operate in legal gray area. My forensic accounting training had included extensive instruction in data recovery methods that could retrieve information from systems where users assumed their activities were private and secure. My parents' banking patterns revealed the systematic nature of their criminal activities with startling clarity. Large deposits corresponding to new client relationships were followed immediately by transfers to offshore accounts that bore no resemblance to the investment opportunities described in their marketing material. Client funds that were supposed to be generating returns through international currency trading were actually being used to fund personal expenses and pay fictitious profits to earlier investors. The Ponzi scheme was more elaborate than I'd initially realized, involving multiple layers of shell companies and foreign banking relationships that created the appearance of legitimate international business activity. New client money was being filtered through Caribbean financial institutions before being transferred to accounts controlled by entities that existed only on paper. The complexity was impressive from a technical standpoint, but it also created numerous points of vulnerability where careful investigation could expose the fraudulent nature of their operation. Even more damaging were the personal expenditures that revealed how client funds were being used to maintain the lifestyle that made their criminal activities possible. The mortgage payments on our Malibu mansion were being made from accounts that contained money stolen from people who believed they were making conservative investment. The monthly bills for their country club memberships, luxury automobiles and designer clothing were paid using resources that belonged to victims whose retirement savings had been diverted into funding my parents' extravagant social life. Every piece of evidence I collected reinforced the understanding that my entire childhood had been subsidized by systematic theft from people who trusted my parents with their financial security. The family vacations I'd treasured, the private schools I'd attended, even the birthday celebrations that had made me feel loved and valued were all purchased with money that belonged to victims whose lives had been damaged by my parents' criminal enterprise. But documentation of their financial crimes was only one component of the comprehensive investigation that would be necessary to ensure appropriate consequences. Understanding the full scope of their operations required insight into their client relationships, their methods for recruiting new victims, and their strategies for maintaining the loyalty of existing investors who might become suspicious about inconsistent returns or delayed payment. The social surveillance phase involved monitoring their activities during the charity galas, country club events, and cultural fundraisers where they cultivated relationships with potential victims. These gatherings provided opportunities to observe their interaction patterns, identify their targeting strategies, and document their methods for gaining access to personal financial information that would later be exploited for criminal purposes. My parents were remarkably sophisticated in their approach to victim selection, focusing on wealthy individuals who valued discretion above transparency and who possessed sufficient resources to make substantial investments without requiring detailed oversight. They avoided clients with extensive business experience who might recognize the warning signs of financial fraud, instead targeting people whose wealth came from inheritance, real estate appreciation, or professional careers outside the financial services industry. The cultivation process was equally systematic, beginning with casual social interactions that established personal trust before gradually introducing investment opportunities that seemed too exclusive to pass up. They positioned themselves as insiders with access to international opportunities that weren't available through conventional financial institutions, appealing to the desire for above-average returns that motivated wealthy individuals to take risks with their accumulated wealth. Most disturbing was their ability to maintain long-term relationships with existing clients, while simultaneously recruiting new victims whose funds would be used to pay fictitious returns to earlier investors. They'd created an elaborate performance of successful money management that convinced people their investments were generating legitimate profits when they were actually receiving payments from a constantly expanding pool of new victims. The audio surveillance revealed conversations that would be devastating if presented to a jury, documenting not just the mechanics of their fraud, but also their callous attitudes toward the people whose lives they were destroying. During private moments when they believed no one could overhear their discussions, my parents spoke about their clients with contempt that revealed their complete lack of empathy for the victims of their criminal activity. Margaret Patterson is becoming tedious with her questions about quarterly statements, my mother complained during a conversation I recorded from their home office, using equipment placed during a brief unauthorized entry. Perhaps it's time to suggest that she might be more comfortable with a traditional investment advisor who can provide the kind of hand-holding she seems to require. She's contributed over $2 million to the fund, my father replied, his tone suggesting that Margaret's financial value outweighed any inconvenience her questions might create. We'll need to manage her concerns carefully until we can recruit enough new participants to phase out her investment without triggering suspicion about our operational structure. The casual discussion of victim management strategies was recorded alongside detailed planning for new fraudulent schemes that would expand their criminal operations into additional market segments. They were developing relationships with younger professionals who possessed substantial earning potential but lacked the financial sophistication to recognize sophisticated fraud schemes. These new targets would provide both immediate investment capital and long-term resources for sustaining their Ponzi scheme as older clients eventually demanded full repayment of their principal investment. But the most revealing recordings captured their discussions about my own role in their future plans, confirming my suspicions that they'd intended to exploit my professional credentials to enhance their ability to victimize innocent people. The job offer I'd received from Morrison Financial Investigations was seen as an opportunity to develop insider knowledge about federal investigation techniques that could be used to protect their criminal activities from law enforcement scrutiny. Sophia's position with Morrison will provide invaluable insight into how federal prosecutors approach white-collar crime cases, my father explained during a conversation with someone I later identified as their attorney. Having access to that kind of information will allow us to structure our operations to avoid the specific patterns that trigger government investigation. The realization that my parents had been planning to turn me into an unwitting accomplice in their criminal enterprise crystallized my determination to ensure that their activities faced comprehensive exposure and appropriate consequence. They'd raised me to value integrity and ethical behavior while simultaneously planning to exploit my professional reputation to enhance their ability to commit financial crime. The scope of their betrayal extended far beyond my personal relationship with them to encompass a systematic attempt to corrupt my professional integrity for their criminal benefit. They'd invested in my education and supported my career development, not because they were proud of my achievements, but because they saw my credentials as tools that could be exploited to protect their illegal activities from detection. Understanding their true motivations for supporting my academic success required reevaluating every interaction we'd had about my career plans and professional goals. The encouragement they'd provided when I'd chosen forensic accounting as my field of study wasn't based on genuine interest in my intellectual development. They'd been strategically positioning their daughter to become a resource for their criminal enterprise, planning to exploit my naivety and professional obligations to shield their activities from the kind of investigation that could expose their fraud. The email surveillance revealed the full extent of their strategic thinking about my future role in their operations. They'd been monitoring my academic progress and professional development, with the same calculation they applied to recruiting new victims for their Ponzi scheme. My research assistantship with Professor Martinez was seen as an opportunity to gain insight into federal investigation procedures. My thesis on financial fraud detection methods was viewed as intelligence gathering that could benefit their operational security. Even my personal relationships had been evaluated for their potential utility to their criminal enterprise. They'd encouraged my friendship with classmates who worked in government agencies, hoping to develop indirect access to information about regulatory priorities and enforcement strategy. My romantic relationships were assessed based on whether my partners might eventually provide access to wealthy social circles that could be exploited for victim recruitment. The systematic nature of their manipulation was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness, extending into every aspect of my life in ways that I'd never suspected. They'd shaped my educational choices, influenced my career development, and guided my social relationships based on how those decisions might eventually serve their criminal interest, rather than my personal well-being or professional success. But their strategic manipulation had also created the foundation for their eventual destruction. By encouraging my specialization in forensic accounting and supporting my research into financial fraud detection methods, they'd inadvertently provided me with exactly the skills necessary to expose their criminal activity. The daughter they'd been grooming to protect their operations possessed the professional expertise required to dismantle everything they'd built. The irony was profound enough to provide satisfaction that balanced the emotional devastation of discovering their true motives for supporting my education. They'd invested years in developing my capabilities as a forensic accountant, because they believed those skills could be exploited for their benefit. Instead, those same capabilities were becoming the foundation for a systematic campaign that would expose their criminal activities and ensure appropriate consequences for their actions. The technical surveillance phase involved deploying electronic monitoring equipment that could document their criminal activities in real time, providing evidence that would be admissible in federal court while protecting my own legal position during the investigation. Modern surveillance technology allows for comprehensive monitoring that creates detailed records of communications, financial transactions, and personal activities without requiring physical proximity to targets or unauthorized entry into private space. The challenge lay in collecting evidence that would meet the stringent requirements of criminal prosecution while operating within legal boundaries that protected my investigation from constitutional challenge. Federal courts have established clear precedents about what types of electronic surveillance are permissible when conducted by private individuals, particularly in cases involving family members who have legitimate reasons to suspect criminal activity. The GPS tracking systems in their automobiles provided real-time location data that could be correlated with their claimed schedules to identify discrepancies that revealed criminal activity. When my father claimed to be meeting with international clients, his actual location data showed visits to local banks where he was conducting transactions related to their Ponzi scheme. When my mother claimed to be attending charity board meetings, her GPS data revealed visits to the homes of wealthy individuals who were being cultivated as potential victims. The communication monitoring revealed coordination between my parents and their co-conspirators that documented the systematic nature of their criminal enterprise. Phone calls with their attorney discussed strategies for structuring transactions to avoid regulatory reporting requirements. Conversations with their accountant revealed methods for concealing the source of funds used to pay fictitious returns to existing investors. Meetings with financial advisors at offshore institutions documented their efforts to move stolen money beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement. Most damaging were the recordings of client meetings where my parents knowingly provided false information about investment opportunities, guaranteed returns that they knew were impossible to achieve through legitimate trading, and made promises about capital protection that were designed to overcome natural skepticism about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. These conversations would be devastating evidence in criminal proceedings because they demonstrated conscious intent to defraud rather than simple negligence or business judgment error. The financial surveillance expanded beyond their primary operations to encompass the entire network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and nominee arrangements that supported their criminal activity. Modern financial crimes leave comprehensive digital trails that can be traced by investigators with appropriate technical skills and legal authority. My forensic accounting training had provided both the technical capabilities and the legal knowledge necessary to conduct this type of systematic investigation. The complexity of their financial structure was impressive from a technical standpoint, involving multiple jurisdictions and numerous intermediary entities that created layers of separation between their personal activities and the ultimate disposition of client funds. But complexity also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sustained investigation, and each additional layer of separation created additional opportunities for documentation and evidence collection. The offshore banking relationships were particularly revealing because they demonstrated the international scope of my parents' criminal activities and their systematic efforts to place stolen funds beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement. The correspondence with foreign financial institutions showed detailed planning for concealing the source of deposited funds and creating documentation that would support false claims about the legitimate nature of their international business activity. But international financial crimes also create opportunities for cooperation with foreign law enforcement agencies, and my investigation was documenting activities that would be of interest to prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. The evidence I was collecting could support criminal charges not just in California but also in the Caribbean financial centers where my parents had established their offshore operations. The social engineering phase involved gathering intelligence about their personal relationships and business connections that could be leveraged during the eventual exposure of their criminal activity. Financial fraud schemes depend on maintaining the confidence of existing victims while recruiting new participants, and both objectives become impossible when the fraudulent nature of operations is exposed to the social networks that criminals rely upon for credibility. My parents' social position within Malibu's elite community was built on their reputation for financial sophistication and their apparent success as international investment consultants. Their membership in exclusive organizations provided access to wealthy individuals who could be targeted for recruitment, while their philanthropic activities enhanced their credibility with potential victims who associated charitable giving with personal integrity. But social positions built on criminal proceeds are inherently vulnerable to exposure, and my investigation was documenting activities that would destroy their reputation within the community that had provided both victims and cover for their operation. The charity boards that my mother served on would be horrified to learn that her donations were funded by money stolen from people who trusted her with their financial security. The country club members who sought her investment advice would be devastated to discover that her recommendations were designed to facilitate theft rather than generate legitimate return. The systematic documentation of their social connections created a target list for victim notification that would maximize the impact of eventual exposure, while ensuring that people who might be considering investments with my parents would be warned about the criminal nature of their operation. The social networks that had enabled their criminal activities would become the mechanism for disseminating information about their fraud. The psychological preparation for confronting my parents required managing emotional responses that threatened to compromise the systematic approach that effective investigation demanded. Every piece of evidence I collected revealed new dimensions of their betrayal, extending far beyond their treatment of me to encompass a pattern of criminal behavior that had damaged dozens of families whose only mistake was trusting people they considered friends. The personal component of their betrayal remained devastating, but it was increasingly overshadowed by the broader implications of their criminal activities. They hadn't just destroyed their relationship with their daughter to protect their operation. They'd been systematically destroying the financial security of people who trusted them, using social relationships and family connections to facilitate theft on a scale that would affect generations of families. Understanding the full scope of their victims' losses provided motivation that transcended personal revenge, creating a sense of responsibility to ensure that their criminal activities faced appropriate consequences. The investigation was no longer just about exposing the people who'd betrayed their daughter, it was about protecting future victims and ensuring that existing victims had access to whatever justice the legal system could provide. The evidence collection phase was nearly complete, but implementation of consequences required strategic planning that would maximize impact while ensuring that my parents couldn't escape accountability through flight or additional criminal activity. Simply turning evidence over to prosecutors would provide them with opportunities to destroy additional documentation or transfer remaining assets beyond the reach of recovery proceedings. More satisfying would be a coordinated approach that exposed their criminal activities to their social network while simultaneously triggering legal consequences that would prevent them from continuing their operation. The revelation needed to be comprehensive enough to destroy their ability to maintain victim confidence while ensuring that law enforcement had everything necessary to pursue criminal charges. The strategy that emerged from weeks of careful planning was inspired by my understanding of how financial fraud schemes collapse when their victims simultaneously demand accountability. Rather than attacking their operations through law enforcement channels that would provide advance warning, I would systematically expose their criminal activities to their existing victims while documenting their responses in ways that would provide additional evidence for criminal prosecution. My parents had expelled me to protect their criminal enterprise from exposure by someone who possessed inconvenient knowledge about their activity. Now I would use every skill I'd developed over 5 years of specialized education to ensure that their protective strategy became the catalyst for complete destruction of everything they'd built through systematic theft and deception. The woman they'd dismissed as an inconvenient liability was about to demonstrate that financial fraud investigators are specifically trained to expose the kind of sophisticated criminal schemes that my parents had spent years perfecting. They'd chosen to protect their criminal activities rather than maintain their relationship with their daughter. Soon they would discover that their daughter possessed exactly the professional capabilities necessary to destroy the criminal enterprise they'd valued more than family loyalty. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear over the Pacific coast, exactly 6 weeks after my parents had expelled me from their lives to protect their criminal enterprise. Standing in my Culver City apartment surrounded by 2 months of meticulously collected evidence, I felt the familiar surge of focused determination that had characterized my most successful academic project. Today would mark the culmination of an investigation that had consumed every waking hour since my 23rd birthday, when I'd learned that my parents valued their fraud scheme more than their relationship with their daughter. The comprehensive documentation filled 14 bankers' boxes with printed financial records, transcribed communications, photographic evidence, and audio recordings that chronicled 2 years of systematic criminal activity. Federal prosecutors would eventually review every document, but today's objectives required a more immediate and personally satisfying approach to ensuring consequences that reflected the scope of my parents' betrayal. The strategy I developed over weeks of careful planning was designed to create a cascade of revelations that would simultaneously expose their criminal activities to their victims, destroy their ability to maintain operational security, and trigger legal responses that would prevent them from escaping accountability through flight or asset concealment. Rather than simply turning evidence over to law enforcement and waiting for the wheels of justice to turn slowly, I would orchestrate a comprehensive destruction of everything they'd built through systematic theft and deception. The timing was perfect because my parents were hosting their annual autumn charity gala at the Malibu Mansion, a lavish fundraising event for the Children's Hospital Foundation that attracted the wealthiest families from throughout Southern California's coastal community. The guest list included dozens of their current and prospective victims, along with the social leaders whose ongoing respect was essential to maintaining the credibility that their operations depended upon. More importantly, the gala would provide opportunities to document their criminal activities in real time while ensuring that maximum number of people witnessed the exposure of their fraud. The sophisticated recording equipment I'd installed throughout the mansion during my surveillance operations would capture every moment of the evening's revelations, creating permanent documentation of their responses that would be invaluable for criminal prosecution. The preparation began at dawn with final checks of all electronic systems and confirmation that backup recording devices were functioning properly. The wireless cameras positioned throughout the mansion would provide multiple angles of every significant interaction, while directional microphones would capture conversations with crystal clarity regardless of background noise from the party.
The GPS tracking systems in their vehicles would document any attempts to flee, and the monitoring software installed on their computers would capture any efforts to delete incriminating evidence. But technology was only one component of a strategy that required perfect timing and flawless execution to achieve its intended impact. The sequence of revelations needed to unfold gradually enough to maintain audience attention while progressing rapidly enough to prevent my parents from regaining control of the narrative or implementing damage control measures.
The first phase involved anonymous notification of selected victims whose losses were particularly devastating and whose social positions would amplify the impact of public exposure. Margaret Patterson had invested her late husband's pension fund with my parents, trusting their promises of capital preservation while they systematically stole her retirement savings. Dr. Richard Chen had provided them with access to his medical colleagues' investment capital, unknowingly facilitating theft from families who relied on those savings for their children's education expenses. The notifications were carefully crafted to provide sufficient evidence to establish credibility while creating urgency that would motivate immediate action. Each victim received copies of financial records showing how their investments had been diverted into my parents' personal accounts, along with documentation of the luxury purchases that their stolen money had funded. The evidence was overwhelming enough to eliminate any possibility of misunderstanding while being comprehensive enough to support immediate legal action. The responses were swift and devastating. Margaret Patterson contacted her attorney within hours of receiving the documentation, initiating civil proceedings that would freeze my parents' domestic assets pending recovery actions. Dr. Chen notified the medical board about potential financial fraud involving physician investors, triggering regulatory investigations that would expose my parents' activities to additional scrutiny. Other victims began coordinating their responses, creating a network of civil litigation that would consume whatever resources my parents had managed to conceal from their criminal activity. But the individual victim notifications were designed to create pressure that would force my parents into reactive modes that would provide additional evidence of their criminal consciousness. The monitoring equipment I'd installed captured their panicked telephone conversations as they tried to assess the scope of exposure and develop strategies for limiting the damage to their operation. "Someone has accessed our files," my mother's voice carried clearly through the audio surveillance system as she spoke to their attorney from the home office where I'd placed multiple recording devices. Margaret Patterson called demanding explanations for discrepancies in her account statements, and she has documentation that should have been impossible for her to obtain. "How much does she know?" their attorney responded, his tone suggesting that this conversation was not the first time they'd discussed strategies for managing client complaints that threatened their operational security. "Everything," my father interjected, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that characterized people whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. "She has copies of the actual bank transfers, the offshore account numbers, even the invoices for personal expenses that were charged against her investment principal. This isn't casual suspicion. Someone has conducted a systematic investigation." The realization that their operational security had been completely compromised triggered increasingly desperate attempts to identify the source of the investigation and develop countermeasures that could limit their legal exposure. The audio surveillance captured detailed discussions about destroying evidence, transferring assets to jurisdictions beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement, and implementing contingency plans that would allow them to escape prosecution. But their countermeasures were being documented in real time by surveillance systems they didn't know existed, creating additional evidence of criminal consciousness that would be devastating in federal court. Every conversation about evidence destruction was recorded, every discussion about asset concealment was preserved, and every plan for evading accountability was captured for eventual presentation to prosecutors. The second phase involved direct confrontation during the charity gala itself, when my parents would be surrounded by the social network that had provided both victims and credibility for their criminal operation. The timing was crucial because their immediate responses to public exposure would reveal the depth of their criminal planning while ensuring that their entire social circle witnessed the destruction of their carefully maintained reputation. The gala proceeded normally during the early evening hours, with elegant conversation and charitable donations that demonstrated the kind of community spirit that my parents had exploited for criminal purposes. The guests included many of the wealthiest families in Southern California, people whose trust and social position had made them perfect targets for sophisticated financial fraud. The irony of their charitable giving was profound, considering that my parents' donations to the Children's Hospital Foundation were funded by money stolen from people who trusted them with their financial security. I arrived at 9 o'clock when the formal program was scheduled to begin with remarks from the foundation's leadership and recognition of major donors, whose generosity made the hospital's work possible. My parents were listed as presenting sponsors, their names prominently displayed on materials that celebrated their commitment to helping sick children receive life-saving medical care. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it would soon be exposed to everyone who had gathered to honor their charitable contributions. The security team that my parents had hired for the evening recognized me immediately but had no instructions about preventing my access to the property. From their perspective, I was the daughter who'd had some kind of family disagreement but remained welcome at family events. They had no idea that I was arriving armed with evidence that would destroy everything my parents had built through systematic criminal activity. The first indication that something was wrong came when several guests began checking their phones and displaying expressions of confusion and alarm. The victim notifications I'd sent earlier in the day were triggering a cascade of communications that was beginning to reach people who had social or business relationships with my parents. Word was spreading through their network that serious questions were being raised about the legitimacy of their investment operation. "Victoria, I need to speak with you privately," said Catherine Morrison, whose husband had invested significant family trust funds with my parents based on their reputation for conservative investment strategy. "I've received some very disturbing information about your business activities, and I think there may be some kind of misunderstanding that needs immediate clarification." The conversation took place near the outdoor bar area where directional microphones captured every word with perfect clarity. My mother's initial response was to express surprise and concern about whatever misinformation might have been circulated, but her tone quickly shifted to defensive when Catherine produced copies of financial records that documented the systematic theft of her family's investment capital. "These documents show that our money was transferred to personal accounts rather than the international trading fund that Marcus described in his presentations," Catherine said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that characterized people whose trust had been systematically exploited. "The bank statements show luxury purchases and personal expenses that were funded using our family's savings. I want explanations, and I want them immediately." The confrontation attracted attention from other guests who began gathering to observe what was clearly becoming a serious dispute rather than casual social conversation. My mother's attempts to deflect Catherine's questions were unconvincing because the evidence was too comprehensive to be dismissed as misunderstandings or clerical error. "There must be some confusion about the account structures," my mother said, her voice betraying the strain of maintaining composure while under direct attack from someone whose social position made public confrontation particularly damaging. "Marcus handles the technical aspects of our investment operations, and I'm sure he can provide clarifications about any apparent discrepancies in the documentation." But Marcus was simultaneously facing his own confrontation with Dr. Chin, whose medical colleagues had begun demanding explanations about investment losses that threatened their retirement security. The audio surveillance captured both conversations simultaneously, creating a stereo recording of my parents' desperate attempts to maintain credibility while being presented with overwhelming evidence of their criminal activity. "The returns you've been reporting are mathematically impossible," Dr. Chen explained to my father, his medical training having provided him with the analytical skills necessary to recognize fraud when presented with proper documentation. "The trading strategies you described couldn't generate these profits without taking risks that contradict your promises about capital preservation. Either you've been lying about your investment methods, or you've been stealing our money and using new investor funds to pay fictitious returns." The accuracy of Dr. Chen's analysis was devastating because it demonstrated that at least some of their victims possessed the technical sophistication necessary to expose the fundamental impossibility of their claimed investment strategy. My father's attempts to provide technical explanations were unconvincing because they contradicted basic principles of financial mathematics that any educated investor could verify independently. The confrontations were attracting increasing attention from other guests who began to realize that they were witnessing something far more serious than routine business disagreement. The social dynamics of the gathering shifted dramatically as people began to distance themselves from my parents while simultaneously trying to understand the implications of what they were observing. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, when maximum number of witnesses were present, and my parents were sufficiently off balance to reveal their true character under pressure. I approached the gathering with the confident stride of someone whose careful planning had achieved exactly its intended results. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the outdoor space where most of the guests had congregated to observe the developing confrontation. "I apologize for interrupting what I'm sure was intended to be a pleasant charitable gathering, but I think it's important that everyone here understands exactly who they've been supporting with their donations and social connection." The recognition was immediate and profound as guests realized that the daughter who'd been absent from recent family events had arrived with what appeared to be significant information about the disputes that were already disrupting the evening's program. My parents' expressions shifted from defensive concern to genuine alarm, as they began to understand that their daughter's arrival was not coincidental but rather the culmination of whatever investigation had exposed their activities to their victim. "Sophia, this isn't appropriate," my father said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood to establish boundaries around topics that were considered private family matters. "Whatever disagreements we've had about family finances should be discussed privately rather than in front of our guests." Family finance. The euphemism was remarkable in its inadequacy for describing systematic criminal activity that had stolen millions of dollars from people who trusted my parents with their financial security. But the phrase also revealed my father's continuing assumption that he could control the narrative by framing criminal fraud as domestic disagreement. "You're absolutely right that this is about family finances," I replied, allowing genuine amusement to color my tone as I activated the tablet that contained the comprehensive evidence I'd been compiling for months. "Specifically, it's about how family finances have been systematically enhanced through theft from people who trusted you with their investment capital." The large display screens that my parents had installed for the charity presentation were still connected to the mansion's wireless network, and my access to their system allowed me to project financial records that documented their criminal activities for everyone present to examine. The first images showed bank statements that traced client investments from their initial deposits through their ultimate disposition in accounts that funded my parents' luxury lifestyle. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, my voice carrying the professional authority I'd developed during graduate school presentations, "what you're seeing are the actual financial records that show how your investments have been systematically stolen to fund the lifestyle that impressed you enough to trust these people with your money." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the coastal mountains and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below the mansion. The guests were staring at documentation that was too comprehensive and detailed to be dismissed as misunderstanding or fabrication, trying to process the implications of evidence that revealed systematic criminal activity by people they'd considered friends. The projected displays showed the complete financial structure of my parents' operations, including the shell companies that had been used to conceal client funds, the offshore accounts that had placed stolen money beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement, and the personal expenditures that had consumed investor capital. The evidence was presented with the same systematic clarity that characterized successful academic research, building from basic facts to comprehensive conclusions that were impossible to dispute. "The house you're standing in was purchased using money stolen from Margaret Patterson's retirement fund," I said, advancing to documentation that showed specific connections between victim losses and my parents' lifestyle enhancement. "The luxury automobiles in the driveway were paid for using Dr. Chen's investment capital. Even tonight's charitable donations to the Children's Hospital Foundation were funded by money that belongs to people whose trust has been systematically exploited for criminal purposes." The impact of connecting their immediate surroundings to specific victim losses was profound, transforming abstract financial fraud into concrete theft that guests could understand in personal terms. The mansion they'd admired became evidence of criminal activity, the elegant furnishings became proceeds of systematic theft, and the charitable donations they'd been celebrating became additional evidence of my parents' callous disregard for their victim. But the personal component of the evening's revelations was yet to come, and I'd saved the most devastating evidence for the moment when my parents would be completely defenseless against exposure of their true character. The audio recordings of their private conversations would reveal not just their criminal activities, but also their attitudes toward the people whose lives they'd been destroying for personal profit. Perhaps most interesting, I said, activating the audio system that would broadcast recordings of my parents' private conversations to everyone present, are the discussions about their victims that reveal exactly what Marcus and Victoria Blackwell really think about the people who trusted them with their financial security. The first recording captured my mother's contemptuous description of Margaret Patterson as a tedious widow who asks too many questions about quarterly statements, followed by strategic discussion about how to manage her concerns until we can recruit enough new participants to phase out her investment without triggering suspicion about our operational structure. The second recording revealed my father's dismissive attitude toward Chen and his medical colleagues, describing them as naive professionals who are impressed by technical jargon they don't understand, and perfect targets because they have substantial earning potential but lack sophisticated understanding of international finance. But the most devastating recordings were those that revealed their discussions about exploiting my professional credentials to enhance their criminal operations, confirming that they'd planned to turn their daughter into an unwitting accomplice in their systematic theft from innocent victims. Sophia's position with Morrison Financial Investigations will provide invaluable insight into how federal prosecutors approach white-collar crime cases. My father's voice carried clearly through the sound system as guests listened to evidence of systematic manipulation that extended even to their treatment of their own daughter. Having access to that kind of information will allow us to structure our operations to avoid the specific patterns that trigger government investigation. The silence that followed these revelations was absolute and devastating, broken only when several guests began leaving immediately without attempting to maintain social pleasantries or offer polite explanations for their departure. The social foundation that had supported my parents' criminal activities was collapsing in real time as people realized that their trust and friendship had been systematically exploited for criminal purposes. The legal consequences began manifesting immediately as guests with legal training began making telephone calls that would trigger formal investigations and civil litigation. The social consequences were equally swift as word spread through text messages and social media posts that would permanently destroy my parents' reputation within the community that had provided both victims and credibility for their operation. The evidence you've just reviewed has been provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution, ensuring that everyone present understood that civil consequences would be accompanied by criminal accountability. Additional copies have been forwarded to the IRS for tax fraud investigation and to international law enforcement agencies in the jurisdictions where stolen funds have been concealed. The comprehensive nature of the law enforcement notifications meant that my parents would face criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions, while simultaneously defending against civil litigation from victims whose losses had been systematically documented. The legal pressure would be sustained and overwhelming, preventing them from escaping accountability through plea negotiations or procedural delay. But the most satisfying element of the evening's revelations was the personal component that addressed my parents' treatment of their daughter and their systematic manipulation of family relationships for criminal purposes. This wasn't just about exposing financial fraud. It was about ensuring that people understood the depth of character required to betray family loyalty in service of criminal enterprise. 6 weeks ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent gathering, Marcus and Victoria Blackwell expelled their daughter from their lives because she'd accidentally discovered evidence of their criminal activity. Rather than acknowledging their crimes or expressing remorse for their victims, they chose to destroy their relationship with their only child in order to protect their ability to continue stealing from people who trusted them. The personal dimension of their betrayal resonated powerfully with guests who were parents themselves,
people who could understand the fundamental violation of family values that my expulsion represented. The choice to prioritize criminal activities over family relationships revealed character defects that extended far beyond financial fraud into basic human decency. They threw me out on my 23rd birthday, I continued, allowing the emotional reality of their betrayal to balance the technical complexity of their criminal activities, because they valued their fraud scheme more than their daughter's love. Tonight seemed like an appropriate time to show them exactly what their daughter learned during the education they funded with stolen money. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, recognition from people who understood that justice had been delivered with elegant precision by someone whose professional training had prepared her for exactly this type of systematic exposure. The woman who'd been dismissed as an inconvenient liability had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything her parents had imagined possible. The immediate aftermath involved coordinated departure of guests who wanted to distance themselves from criminal activity while ensuring that their own legal and financial positions were protected from association with systematic fraud. The social isolation was complete and permanent, destroying the network of relationships that had provided both victims and operational security for my parents' criminal enterprise. The law enforcement response was swift and comprehensive, with federal agents arriving within hours to execute search warrants that would seize all remaining evidence and prevent any additional destruction of documentation. The criminal charges that followed included conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, ensuring that my parents would face decades in federal prison if convicted on all counts. The civil litigation was equally devastating, with victim lawsuits seeking recovery of stolen funds while civil forfeiture proceedings targeted every asset that had been purchased using proceeds of criminal activity. The mansion where they'd hosted their final social gathering was seized within days, along with their automobiles, jewelry, and offshore accounts that had been identified through my investigation. But the most lasting consequences were personal rather than legal or financial. The parents who had expelled their daughter to protect their criminal activities discovered that their daughter possessed exactly the capabilities necessary to destroy everything they'd built through systematic theft and deception. The education they'd funded with stolen money had produced a forensic accountant whose professional expertise made her uniquely qualified to expose their crime. 6 months later, I sat in the downtown office of Morrison Financial Investigations, reviewing case files for corporate fraud investigations that would benefit from the specialized skills I'd developed during my unofficial investigation of my parents' criminal activity. The experience had provided practical training that complemented my academic education while demonstrating my capabilities to supervisors who were impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism I worked. Marcus and Victoria Blackwell were serving federal prison sentences that reflected the scope of their criminal activities and the devastating impact their fraud had on victims whose trust they'd systematically exploited. The plea agreements they'd eventually accepted included full asset forfeiture and cooperation with ongoing investigations into financial fraud schemes that targeted wealthy individuals through social engineering techniques. The victims whose lives had been damaged by my parents' crimes were receiving partial recovery through civil litigation and criminal restitution orders, though the emotional impact of betrayal by people they'd considered friends would take longer to heal than their financial losses. Several had expressed gratitude for the investigation that exposed the fraud before additional families could be victimized. The professional recognition that followed my successful exposure of a sophisticated financial fraud scheme led to opportunities that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible when beginning my graduate education. Federal prosecutors recruited me as a consultant for complex white-collar crime cases, and corporate security firms sought my expertise for investigations involving family-controlled businesses where traditional audit procedures might miss systematic theft. The lesson had been delivered with the kind of precision that reflects proper training and systematic preparation. People who choose to value criminal activities over family relationships should remember that their children might possess professional capabilities that make them uniquely qualified to expose exactly the kind of crimes their parents think they're sophisticated enough to conceal. The woman who'd been expelled to protect a criminal enterprise had demonstrated that forensic accountants are specifically trained to investigate and expose financial fraud regardless of their personal relationship to the perpetrator. Justice had been achieved through patient investigation and strategic revelation that ensured comprehensive consequences for people whose systematic betrayal of trust deserved nothing less than complete destruction of everything they'd built through criminal activity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.